After 30 years of living in luxury and wealth, the rich heiress discovers that her true mother is the housemaid. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the crowd of California's elite, their laughter mingling with the soft jazz floating through the air. Madison Green, resplendent in a champagne-colored gown that cost more than most people's monthly rent, surveyed her kingdom with a practiced smile. This was her element, or at least it should have been. Madison, darling. A woman with perfectly coiffed silver hair air-kissed both of Madison's cheeks. This party is simply divine. You've outdone yourself again. Madison's smile didn't quite reach her eyes as she replied, "Thank you, Mrs. Hartley. I'm so glad you could make it." As Mrs. Hartley moved on to gush over the imported orchids adorning the tables, Madison felt a familiar hollowness creep into her chest. She glanced around the room, taking in the glittering jewels, the tailored suits, the carefully cultivated air of importance that clung to each guest like an expensive perfume. It was all so empty. A waiter appeared at her elbow, offering a tray of champagne flutes. Madison took one, more out of habit than desire, and sipped the bubbly liquid. It tasted like ash on her tongue. "Miss Green?" A soft voice cut through her reverie. Madison turned to find Ruth, her family's longtime maid, standing nearby with a concerned look on her face. "Is everything all right?" For a moment, Madison was struck by the warmth in Ruth's dark eyes. It was a stark contrast to the calculating gazes of her party guests. "I'm fine, Ruth," she said, forcing a smile. "Just a bit overwhelmed by all the excitement." Ruth nodded, her expression knowing. "Of course. If you need anything, I'll be in the kitchen." As Ruth turned to leave, Madison felt an inexplicable urge to call her back, to seek comfort in the presence of the woman who had been a constant in her life for as long as she could remember. But the moment passed, and Ruth disappeared into the crowd. The party dragged on, a blur of fake smiles and meaningless small talk. By the time the last guest had departed, leaving behind empty glasses and the lingering scent of expensive cologne, Madison felt drained. She kicked off her heels, relishing the cool marble against her bare feet, and made her way to the kitchen. Ruth was there as always, wiping down the counters with efficient movements. She looked up as Madison entered, concern etching lines around her mouth. "Can I get you anything, Miss Green?" Madison shook her head, leaning against the doorframe. "No, I needed a moment of quiet." Ruth's eyes softened. "It was a long night. Perhaps some chamomile tea to help you sleep." The offer was tempting, but Madison declined. "I think I'll just head up to bed. Thank you, Ruth, for everything." As she climbed the grand staircase, Madison's gaze was drawn to the family portraits lining the walls. Generations of Greens stared back at her, their pale faces a testament to old money and carefully preserved bloodlines. She'd always felt a disconnect from these stern-faced ancestors, but tonight the feeling was almost overwhelming. Unable to face the emptiness of her bedroom, Madison found herself wandering into the attic. Dust motes danced in the moonlight streaming through the small window, giving the cluttered space an otherworldly feel. She ran her fingers along old trunks and forgotten furniture, relics of a family history she'd never fully embraced. A small, ornate box caught her eye. It seemed out of place among the larger pieces, tucked away as if it held secrets too dangerous to be left in plain sight. Curiosity piqued. Madison carefully lifted the lid. Inside, nestled among faded photographs and brittle newspaper clippings, was a letter. The paper was yellowed with age, the handwriting elegant but shaky, as if written by someone fighting against time itself. Madison's heart quickened as she unfolded it, her eyes scanning the words that would shatter her world. "My dearest Madison, if you're reading this, then I am gone, and the truth I've carried for so long can finally be revealed. You've grown up believing yourself to be a Green, heir to a fortune and a legacy. But the truth is far more complicated and far more beautiful. You are my daughter, Madison, mine and Thomas Green's, a love that crossed boundaries of race and class, a secret we've kept to protect you from a world that might not understand. Ruth Johnson, the woman you've known as our maid, is your biological mother. She agreed to this arrangement to give you opportunities she could never provide, but her love for you has never wavered. I hope you can forgive us for the deception. Know that you were born of love, and that your true heritage is something to be celebrated, not hidden. With all my love, Elizabeth Green. The letter slipped from Madison's trembling fingers, fluttering to the floor like a fallen leaf. She stared at it, her mind refusing to process the words that had just turned her entire existence upside down. Ruth. Ruth was her mother, the woman who had raised her, comforted her, been there for every scraped knee and broken heart. She wasn't just the family maid. She was the woman who had given her life. Memories flooded Madison's mind. Ruth's gentle hands braiding her hair, her warm voice singing lullabies, the way she always seemed to know exactly what Madison needed before she even asked. How had she never seen it before? A sob caught in Madison's throat, threatening to break free. She pressed a hand to her mouth, muffling the sound as tears began to stream down her face. Everything she thought she knew about herself, her family, her place in the world, it was all a carefully constructed lie. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the attic window, Madison sat amidst the dusty relics of her family's past, cradling the letter that had shattered her present and irrevocably altered her future. The hollowness she'd felt earlier was gone, replaced by a storm of emotions she couldn't begin to untangle. One thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same again. The party guests, the champagne, the glittering facade of her life. It all seemed like a distant dream now. Madison Green, heiress and socialite, had ceased to exist. In her place was a woman adrift, searching for an identity she'd never known she'd lost. As the sun rose over the sprawling green estate, casting long shadows across manicured lawns and marble fountains, Madison made a silent vow. She would uncover the truth of her heritage, no matter the cost, and she would find a way to bridge the chasm between the life she'd known and the reality she'd just discovered. With trembling hands, she folded the letter and slipped it into her pocket. It was time to face Ruth, to face her mother, and begin the journey towards understanding who she truly was. The morning sun filtered through the ornate curtains of the Green mansion, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor. Madison stood before the mirror in her bedroom, barely recognizing the woman staring back at her. Dark circles underscored her eyes, testament to a sleepless night spent grappling with the earth-shattering revelation. Her trembling fingers clutched the letter, now creased and worn from countless rereadings. Each word was etched into her memory, a stark reminder that everything she thought she knew about herself was built on a foundation of lies. A soft knock at the door startled her from her reverie. "Ms. Green?" Ruth's familiar voice called out. "Are you all right? You missed breakfast." Madison's heart raced. The woman she'd known her entire life as a maid, as a friend, was standing just beyond that door. Her mother. The word felt foreign, almost blasphemous in her mind. "Come in," Madison managed, her voice barely above a whisper. The door opened, and Ruth stepped inside, concern etched across her face. She froze when she saw Madison's disheveled appearance and the letter in her hand. "Oh," Ruth breathed, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You found it." The simple acknowledgement broke something inside Madison. "How could you?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "How could you let me believe all these years?" Ruth's shoulders sagged, the weight of decades of secrecy finally taking its toll. "Madison, Don't," Madison cut her off. "Don't call me that. I don't even know who I am anymore. Was anything in my life real?" Tears welled in Ruth's eyes. "Your name is real. Your father, Thomas, he insisted on naming you Madison. It was his grandmother's name." Madison laughed bitterly. Oh, how generous of him, to give me a name while denying me my heritage, my identity. "We wanted to protect you," Ruth said softly, taking a tentative step forward. It's not always kind to people who are different. We thought—" "You thought stripping me of my identity was protection?" Madison interrupted, anger flaring. "Letting me grow up in this bubble of privilege, completely ignorant of who I really am?" Ruth flinched at the harshness in Madison's tone. It wasn't an easy decision, but we wanted to give you opportunities that we couldn't have provided otherwise. Madison's anger deflated slightly, replaced by a deep, aching sadness. But at what cost, Ruth? Do you have any idea what it's like to suddenly realize your entire life has been a lie? No, Ruth admitted, her voice barely audible. I don't. And I'm sorry, Madison. We thought we were doing the right thing. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with years of unspoken truths and missed opportunities. Madison sank onto the edge of her bed, suddenly exhausted. I don't know how to process this, Ruth. I don't know how to be whoever I am now. Ruth hesitated before sitting beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. You're still you, Madison. This doesn't change who you are at your core. Doesn't it? Madison questioned, meeting Ruth's gaze. I've lived my entire life as Madison Green, heiress and socialite, but that person, she isn't real, she never was. Then maybe, Ruth suggested gently, it's time to figure out who you really are. The words hung in the air, a challenge and an opportunity. Madison stood abruptly, pacing the room as her mind raced. I can't do that here, she realized aloud. Not in this house, surrounded by all of this. She gestured vaguely at the opulent surroundings. Ruth nodded, a mix of understanding and sorrow in her eyes. What will you do? Madison paused, her gaze falling on a framed photo of herself with Elizabeth and Thomas Green, the people she'd always known as her parents. The perfect family portrait now seemed like a cruel joke. I need to leave, she declared, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. I need to understand where I come from, who I am outside of all this privilege and pretense. Madison, Ruth began, her voice tinged with worry. The world out there, it's not like what you're used to. It can be harsh, unforgiving. A wry smile tugged at Madison's lips. Maybe that's exactly what I need. To see the world as it really is, not through the rose-tinted glasses I've worn my whole life. She turned to face Ruth, really seeing her for the first time. The lines etched around her eyes spoke of years of hard work and worry. Her hands, calloused and worn, told a story of sacrifice that Madison was only beginning to understand. I have so many questions, Madison said softly, about you, about my father, about why you made the choices you did. But I can't hear those answers right now. I need to figure things out for myself first. Ruth nodded, tears spilling onto her cheeks. I understand, and when you're ready, I'll be here. I'll tell you everything. Madison felt a lump form in her throat. Despite her anger and confusion, a part of her wanted nothing more than to fall into Ruth's arms, to be comforted as she had been so many times throughout her childhood. But she held back, knowing that if she gave in now, she might never find the strength to leave. I need some time, she said instead, to pack, to think. Ruth stood, wiping her eyes. Of course, take all the time you need. She paused at the door, looking back at Madison with a mixture of love and regret. Just know that no matter what, you are loved. You always have been. As the door closed behind Ruth, Madison allowed herself a moment to break down. Sobs racked her body as she mourned the life she thought she had, the identity she'd lost, and the relationship with Ruth that would never be the same. But as the tears subsided, a new determination took hold. She would leave this gilded cage, strip away the layers of privilege and pretense, and discover who she truly was beneath it all. Madison moved with purpose, throwing open her closet doors. She bypassed the designer gowns and custom-tailored suits, reaching instead for the few casual items she owned. Jeans, t-shirts, comfortable shoes, clothes that wouldn't immediately mark her as an outsider in the world she was about to enter. As she packed, her eyes fell on the jewelry box on her dresser. Inside lay a fortune in diamonds and precious gems, each piece a testament to the excess of her former life. Without hesitation, she snapped the lid shut and tossed the entire box into her suitcase. She might need to sell some pieces to fund her journey. A thought struck her, and she reached for her phone, quickly transferring a significant sum from her trust fund to a new, separate account. She had no illusions about the difficulties she might face, but she wasn't naive enough to leave herself completely vulnerable. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn, Madison stood at the entrance of the green mansion. Her suitcase sat beside her, containing the bare essentials of her new life. In her hand, she clutched the letter that had changed everything. Ruth appeared in the doorway, her eyes red-rimmed but her posture resolute. "Are you sure about this?" she asked softly. Madison nodded. "I have to do this, Ruth. I need to understand where I come from, who I am outside of all this." She gestured to the mansion behind them. "I understand," Ruth said, her voice thick with emotion. "Just be safe, and know that you always have a home here, no matter what." For a moment, Madison hesitated. The urge to stay, to sink back into the comfort of the only life she'd ever known, was almost overwhelming. But then she thought of the lies, the deception, and the part of herself that had been hidden away for so long. "I'll be back," she promised, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "When I've figured things out, when I understand, I'll come back, and then we can talk. Really talk." Ruth nodded, a sad smile on her face. "I'll be waiting." With a deep breath, Madison turned and walked down the driveway. She didn't look back as she reached the gates, as she hailed a taxi, as the driver pulled away from the only home she'd ever known. As the lights of the city began to twinkle in the gathering dusk, Madison felt a strange mix of terror and exhilaration. She had no idea what lay ahead, no plan beyond a vague notion of discovering her roots, but for the first time in her life, Madison felt truly alive. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges she couldn't begin to imagine, but it was her path, chosen by her, leading to a truth she was only beginning to understand. As the green mansion faded from view in the rear-view mirror, Madison closed her eyes. When she opened them again, she would be someone new, someone real, and she was ready to meet that person no matter where the journey might lead. The taxi lurched to a stop, jolting Madison from her uneasy slumber. She blinked, disoriented, as she took in her surroundings. Gone were the manicured lawns and gleaming mansions of her childhood. In their place stood weathered buildings, their paint peeling under the harsh summer sun. "You sure this is where you want to be, miss?" the driver asked, eyeing her skeptically in the rearview mirror. Madison swallowed hard, fighting back a wave of doubt. "Yes," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "This is it." As she stepped out of the taxi, the reality of her decision hit her full force. The air was thick with the scent of fried food and car exhaust, a far cry from the carefully cultivated rose gardens of the green estate. Children played on the sidewalk, their laughter a sharp contrast to the somber faces of adults hurrying past. Madison grabbed her suitcase, its designer label suddenly garish in these surroundings. She'd barely taken 2 steps when she felt eyes on her, curious and slightly suspicious glances from passers-by. "You lost, honey?" an older woman called from her perch on a nearby stoop, her eyes kind but wary. I'm looking for 1247 Maple Street," Madison replied, realizing too late that she probably should have researched Ruth's address before arriving. The woman's eyebrows shot up. "Ruth Johnson's place? You a relative or something?" Madison hesitated, the truth sticking in her throat. "Something like that," she managed. The woman pointed down the street. "Third house on the left. Can't miss it. Got them yellow curtains in the window." With a murmured thanks, Madison set off. Each step felt like a monumental effort, the weight of her suitcase nothing compared to the burden of her racing thoughts. What if Ruth wasn't here? What if she was turned away? What if... Her internal spiral was cut short as she reached the house. It was small, its white paint faded and chipping in places, but the yellow curtains in the window gave it a cheerful air. Madison took a deep breath and raised her hand to knock. The door swung open before her knuckles could make contact. "I was wondering when you'd show up," Ruth said softly, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Madison stood frozen, all her carefully prepared speeches evaporating in the face of Ruth's quiet acceptance. "How did you know?" she finally managed. Ruth's lips quirked in a sad smile. "A mother always knows, child." The word mother hung between them, heavy with unspoken emotion. Before Madison could respond, a commotion down the street caught their attention. A group of young men was gathering, their voices raised in anger. At their center stood a tall, broad-shouldered man with intense eyes and a determined set to his jaw. "That's Jamal," Ruth explained, her voice tinged with worry. "He's been organizing protests against the new development project. It's been tense around here lately." Madison watched, transfixed, as Jamal addressed the crowd. His words, though indistinct from this distance, carried a passion and urgency that seemed to electrify his listeners. "Come inside," Ruth urged gently. "It's not safe to be out when things get heated like this." As they entered the small house, Madison was struck by the stark contrast to her childhood home. Where the green mansion had been all cold marble and priceless artworks, Ruth's home was warm, filled with mismatched furniture and walls covered in family photos. "I know it's not what you're used to," Ruth began apologetically, but Madison cut her off. "It's perfect," she said, surprising herself with her sincerity. "It feels like a home." Ruth's eyes filled with tears, but before she could respond, a sharp knock at the door made them both jump. "Ms. Johnson," a deep voice called out, "it's Jamal. Is everything okay? I saw someone unfamiliar enter your house." Ruth shot Madison a questioning look. At her nod, Ruth opened the door. Jamal filled the doorframe, his imposing presence softened by the concern in his eyes. Those eyes widened in surprise as they landed on Madison. "Who's this?" he asked, his tone wary. "This is Madison," Ruth said carefully. "She's family." Jamal's eyebrows shot up. "Family? I didn't know you had family coming to visit, Ms. Johnson." "It was unexpected," Madison interjected, stepping forward. "I'm Ruth's daughter." The silence that followed was deafening. Jamal's gaze flicked between Madison and Ruth, confusion giving way to understanding, then to something harder. "Daughter," he repeated, his voice flat. "Well, isn't that interesting? I guess some secrets run deeper than others in this neighborhood." Madison felt a flash of anger at his tone. "I only just found out myself," she snapped. "I'm here to understand, to learn." "To learn what?" Jamal interrupted. "How the other half lives. Is this some kind of poverty tourism for you?" "Jamal," Ruth admonished, but Madison held up a hand. "No, it's okay," she said, meeting Jamal's challenging gaze. "You're right to be suspicious. I grew up differently. But I'm here because I want to understand where I come from, who I really am." Jamal studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. "All right. You want to understand? Come with me. I'll show you what life is really like around here." Ruth started to protest, but Madison cut her off. "I'll go," she said firmly. "I need to see this." As they stepped out into the fading afternoon light, Madison felt a mix of trepidation and excitement. This was why she had come, to see the world through new eyes, to understand the life she might have lived. Jamal led her through the neighborhood, pointing out landmarks that painted a vivid picture of community life. The underfunded school with its outdated textbooks, the clinic struggling to serve too many patients with too few resources, the community center that doubled as a food bank and job training facility. With each stop, Madison felt her worldview shifting, her understanding of privilege and struggle deepening in ways she had never imagined. "This is what we're fighting for," Jamal explained, as they stood before an empty lot surrounded by chain-link fencing. "This was supposed to be affordable housing. Instead, they're planning luxury condos. People are being pushed out of their homes, their community destroyed for profit." Madison stared at the lot, her mind racing. In her old life, she might have seen this as progress, as simple economics. Now she saw the human cost, the lives disrupted, and dreams shattered. "What can be done?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jamal turned to her, surprise flickering across his face at her genuine interest. "We fight," he said simply. "We organize, we protest, we make our voices heard. It's not easy, and sometimes it feels hopeless, but it's all we have." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the neighborhood, Madison felt something shift inside her. The world she had known, with its gilded cages and comfortable illusions, seemed a lifetime away. "Thank you," she said to Jamal as they walked back to Ruth's house, "for showing me, for being honest with me." Jamal nodded. His earlier hostility softened somewhat. "You're welcome. But this was just a glimpse. If you really want to understand, you've got a lot more to learn." Madison squared her shoulders, a determined glint in her eye. "Then teach me. I want to help, to make a difference." For the first time, a hint of a smile tugged at Jamal's lips. "We'll see," he said. "Actions speak louder than words around here. But if you're serious, maybe you can start by coming to our community meeting tomorrow night." As they reached Ruth's door, Madison felt a surge of anticipation. She had come seeking answers about her past, but she was beginning to realize that her future might be irrevocably changed by this journey. "I'll be there," she promised Jamal. And as she watched him walk away, Madison knew that her life would never be the same again. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges she was only beginning to understand. But for the first time in her life, she felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. The early morning sun filtered through the yellow curtains, casting a warm glow across Madison's borrowed bedroom. She lay awake, the unfamiliar creaks and groans of Ruth's old house, a stark reminder of how far she'd come from her life of luxury. A soft knock at the door roused her from her thoughts. "Madison," Ruth's voice called gently. "Are you awake? I've made breakfast." The scent of coffee and something sweet wafted through the air, tugging at childhood memories Madison hadn't realized she possessed. "I'll be right there," she called back, her voice thick with emotion. In the small, cozy kitchen, Ruth stood at the stove, flipping what looked like the last of a stack of pancakes. The scene was so domestic, so maternal, that Madison felt a lump form in her throat. "I hope you still like blueberry pancakes," Ruth said, a hint of uncertainty in her voice. "You used to beg for them every Sunday when you were little." Madison blinked back tears. I didn't know that was you. I always thought it was the cook who made them." Ruth's smile was tinged with sadness. "I was the cook, among other things. Your father, Thomas, he insisted I be the one to prepare your meals. I think it was his way of letting me be close to you." The weight of unspoken history hung heavy in the air. Madison sat at the small kitchen table, accepting a plate piled high with pancakes. "Ruth," she began hesitantly, "I think I'm ready to hear more. About you, about my father. About why you made the choices you did." Ruth sighed deeply, joining Madison at the table. "It's a long story, child, and not an easy one to tell." As Ruth spoke, painting a vivid picture of her youth, Madison felt as though she were being pulled through time. She saw Ruth as a young woman, full of dreams and ambition, working multiple jobs to put herself through nursing school. She learned of the night Ruth met Thomas Green at the hospital where she interned. He, a young doctor from a wealthy family. She, a struggling student facing racial prejudice at every turn. "We fell in love," Ruth said softly, her eyes distant with memory. "It was foolish, we both knew it. But love isn't always wise." The tale unfolded like a bittersweet novel. Secret meetings, stolen moments of happiness, and the crushing weight of societal expectations. When Ruth discovered she was pregnant, the world seemed to collapse around them. Thomas's family would have disowned him, Ruth explained, her voice heavy with old pain. And in those days, that meant more than just losing money. It meant losing his career, his future, everything. Madison listened, her heart aching for the young couple faced with an impossible choice. "So you decided to give me up?" Ruth shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. "Not give you up, never that. We decided I would stay, would raise you as best I could from within the household. It wasn't perfect, but it allowed me to be near you, to love you, even if I couldn't claim you as my own." The weight of this revelation settled over Madison like a heavy blanket. All those years, all those small kindnesses she'd taken for granted, they'd been acts of a mother's love, hidden in plain sight. Before Madison could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention. Raised voices and the sound of breaking glass shattered the moment. Ruth was on her feet in an instant, worry etched across her face. "It's starting again," she muttered, moving to the window. Madison joined her, gasping at the scene unfolding on the street. A group of men in business suits, flanked by police officers, stood facing off against a crowd of local residents. At the forefront, his voice rising above the din, stood Jamal. "They can't do this," he shouted, his words carrying clearly through the morning air. "This is our home. You can't just tear it down for your profits." One of the suited men stepped forward, his voice condescending. "This is a legal eviction, sir. The property has been purchased, and the residents have been given notice." Madison watched in horror as the tension escalated. Without thinking, she moved towards the door. "Madison, wait!" Ruth called out, but Madison was already stepping onto the porch. The scene before her was chaos. Neighbors she'd only just begun to recognize were being forcibly removed from their homes, their belongings scattered across unkempt lawns. Children cried, clinging to their parents' legs. The air was thick with desperation and anger. Madison's eyes found Jamal, his face a mask of fury and determination as he stood between the officials and a terrified-looking elderly couple. "You can't do this," Jamal was saying, his voice hoarse from shouting. "These people have nowhere else to go." One of the officers moved forward, hand on his weapon. "Sir, step aside, or you'll be arrested for obstruction." Madison felt a surge of something she'd never experienced before, a visceral, righteous anger that burned away her hesitation. Before she knew what she was doing, she was striding across the street, placing herself beside Jamal. "Stop!" she called out, her voice ringing with an authority she didn't know she possessed. "This is unacceptable." The suited men turned, their expressions a mix of surprise and annoyance. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you," one began, but Madison cut him off. "Actually, it does," she said, her mind racing. "I'm Madison Green, of the Green Foundation, and I'm telling you right now, this eviction is not going to happen." A ripple of confusion passed through the crowd. Jamal shot her a questioning look, but Madison pressed on, drawing on every ounce of the privilege she'd spent her life taking for granted. "The Green Foundation has a vested interest in the well-being of this community," she improvised, silently thanking her years of watching her father navigate business dealings. "Any action taken here without our consultation is in direct violation of our agreement with the city." It was a bluff, a desperate gamble based on nothing but her family name and her own audacity. But to her amazement, it seemed to be working. The suited men huddled together, speaking in urgent whispers. Finally, the one who seemed to be in charge stepped forward. "We'll need to confirm this with our legal team," he said, his earlier confidence notably diminished. "In the meantime, we'll suspend the eviction proceedings." A cheer went up from the crowd, a sound of relief and cautious hope. As the officials began to withdraw, Madison felt the adrenaline that had been coursing through her veins start to ebb, leaving her shaky and overwhelmed. Jamal turned to her, his expression a mix of gratitude and suspicion. "Green Foundation?" he asked quietly. Madison swallowed hard. "It's, complicated," she admitted. "But I meant what I said. I want to help." Jamal studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "All right," he said. "But you've just put yourself in the middle of a war, Madison. I hope you're ready for what comes next." As the crowd began to disperse, Madison felt the weight of countless eyes upon her. She had acted on impulse, driven by a sense of injustice she was only beginning to understand. Now, standing amid the community she'd inadvertently pledged to protect, she realized the true magnitude of the challenge ahead. Ruth appeared at her side, worry and pride warring in her eyes. "Oh, child," she murmured, squeezing Madison's hand. "You're so like your father, always rushing in to fight for what's right, consequences be damned." The comparison to her father, her real father, sent a jolt through Madison. She was standing at a crossroads, she realized. The path ahead was fraught with difficulty, threatening to upend everything she'd ever known about herself and her place in the world. But as she looked around at the faces of the people she'd just defended, tired, scared, but now tinged with hope, Madison knew she couldn't turn back. This was where she belonged, where she could make a real difference. "I'm ready," she said, as much to herself as to Jamal and Ruth. "Whatever comes next, I'm ready to face it." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting harsh light on the realities of life in this struggling neighborhood, Madison felt a sense of purpose settle over her. The journey to discover her true self had led her here, to this moment, to these people. And though the road ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges she was only beginning to understand, Madison knew one thing for certain: she was exactly where she needed to be. The days following the near eviction blurred together in a whirlwind of activity. Madison found herself thrust into the heart of the community's struggle, attending meetings, making phone calls, and using every connection she could think of to stall the development plans. But as the sun set on another exhausting day, Madison found herself drawn to the quiet of Ruth's small backyard. She sat on the creaky porch swing, watching fireflies dance in the gathering twilight. "Mind if I join you?" Ruth's soft voice broke through her reverie. Madison looked up, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Please," she said, patting the space beside her. Ruth settled onto the swing, the old wood groaning slightly under their combined weight. For a moment, they sat in companionable silence, the only sound the gentle creak of the swing's chains and the distant hum of cicadas. "You've been working so hard," Ruth said finally, her voice tinged with a mixture of pride and concern. "I worry you're pushing yourself too much." Madison shook her head. "I feel like I'm finally doing something that matters," she admitted. "All those years in that big house surrounded by wealth and privilege, what did I ever really accomplish?" Ruth's hand found hers, squeezing gently. "You were a child, Madison. You weren't meant to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders." "But you did," Madison said softly, turning to face Ruth. "You carried so much, for so long. How did you do it?" Ruth's eyes grew distant, filled with memories. "One day at a time," she said, "and with love, always with love." The simple statement hung in the air between them, heavy with years of unspoken emotion. Madison felt tears prick at her eyes. "I wish I had known," she whispered. "All those years, I wish I had understood what you were to me." Ruth's own eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Oh, my sweet girl," she murmured. "I may not have been able to claim you as my daughter, but you were always, always loved." The dam broke. Madison fell into Ruth's arms, decades of missed embraces and unshared confidences pouring out in a flood of tears. Ruth held her close, her own cheeks wet as she stroked Madison's hair. "I'm so sorry," Madison sobbed, "for every time I was rude or dismissive or—" "Shh," Ruth soothed. "None of that matters now. We're here, together. That's what's important." As their tears subsided, Madison felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The confusion and anger that had driven her from her old life seemed to melt away, replaced by a sense of belonging she'd never known she was missing. "Tell me about him," Madison said suddenly, sitting up. "My father, the real Thomas Green." Ruth's smile was bittersweet. "He was complicated," she began. "Brilliant, compassionate, always wanting to do the right thing, but also trapped by expectations, by the world he was born into." As Ruth spoke, painting a picture of the man who had loved them both, Madison felt a connection to her past that she'd never experienced before. The Thomas Green she'd known, distant, often absent, always slightly disappointed, faded away, replaced by a more human figure, flawed but loving. "He wanted to be there for you," Ruth said softly. "Every missed birthday, every school event he couldn't attend. It tore him apart, but he believed he was giving you your best chance at a good life." Madison nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "I understand now," she said. "I don't know if I can forgive everything, but I understand." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the back door. Jamal stood there, looking slightly apologetic. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, "but we've got a situation. The developers are trying to push through an expedited approval process. We need to act fast." Madison straightened, her mind already racing with possibilities. "We need to show them that this community isn't just a bunch of statistics on a spreadsheet," she said. We need to make them see the human cost of what they're doing. Jamal nodded, a spark of excitement in his eyes. What are you thinking? A community event, Madison said, the idea taking shape as she spoke. Something big, something that will attract attention. We'll invite the media, local politicians, anyone who might be able to influence the decision. Ruth leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. The old community center, she suggested. It's been abandoned for years, but it used to be the heart of this neighborhood. If we could fix it up, even temporarily. That's perfect, Jamal agreed. We could showcase local businesses, artists, the programs we're trying to save, make them see what they'd be destroying. As they began to plan, Madison felt a surge of energy. This was what she was meant to do, she realized. Not just write checks or attend charity galas, but to be on the ground, working alongside the people she wanted to help. The next few days were a blur of activity. Madison threw herself into the preparations, using every skill she'd learned in her previous life of organizing high society events. But this was different. Every task, from cleaning up the old community center to coordinating volunteers, felt imbued with purpose. She worked side by side with her neighbors, getting to know their stories, their struggles, and their dreams. The more she learned, the more determined she became to fight for this community. Ruth was a constant presence, offering support and guidance. Madison found herself turning to her mother, and the word no longer felt strange in her mind, for advice and comfort. They were building the relationship they should have had all along, and Madison treasured every moment. As the day of the event drew near, Madison found herself back on the porch swing with Ruth, taking a rare moment of quiet. "I'm proud of you," Ruth said softly. "So proud of the woman you've become." Madison felt a warmth spread through her chest. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," she replied. "You gave me the strength to find my way here." Ruth's eyes shimmered with emotion. "You always had that strength, Madison. It was always a part of you, you just needed to find it." As they sat together watching the sun set on the eve of their big event, Madison felt a sense of peace settle over her. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. The community that had once seemed so foreign to her had become home. The woman beside her, once a distant figure in her life, was now the anchor she'd always needed. And the purpose she'd been searching for had finally become clear. Madison Green, daughter of Ruth Johnson, was ready to face whatever came next. Not alone, but surrounded by the love and support of her true family, both by blood and by choice. As night fell, the porch light flickering on automatically, Madison and Ruth remained on the swing. Their quiet conversation punctuated by soft laughter and occasional tears. They were making up for lost time, yes, but more than that, they were building a future, together. The morning of the community event dawned bright and clear, a perfect blue sky stretching over the neighborhood. Madison stood in front of the old community center, taking in the transformation. What had once been a dilapidated building was now alive with color and activity, its walls adorned with murals painted by local artists, its windows gleaming in the early morning light. "We really did it," Jamal said, coming to stand beside her. His voice held a note of wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe what they'd accomplished. Madison nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "We're not done yet," she replied, her voice filled with determination. "This is just the beginning." As volunteers began to arrive, setting up booths and arranging displays, Madison felt a familiar surge of adrenaline. This was what she was good at, organizing, delegating, making sure every detail was perfect. But unlike the society galas of her past, this event held real meaning, real purpose. Ruth appeared, carrying a tray of homemade pastries. "For the volunteers," she explained with a warm smile. "Can't have them working on empty stomachs." Madison felt a rush of affection for her mother. "You didn't have to do that," she said, even as she reached for a still warm cinnamon roll. "Of course I did," Ruth replied, her eyes twinkling. "This is what community is all about. Everyone doing their part, no matter how small." As the morning wore on, the old community center buzzed with activity. Local business owners set up displays showcasing their products and services. Community organizations prepared presentations on the programs they offered. In one corner, a group of children worked on a massive "Save Our Neighborhood" banner, their small faces screwed up in concentration as they carefully painted each letter. Madison moved through it all, checking details, solving last-minute problems, and offering encouragement where needed. She was so focused on her tasks that she almost missed the arrival of the first media van. "Heads up," Jamal called out, nodding towards the street. "Looks like your plan worked. The press is here." Madison took a deep breath, steeling herself. This was the moment of truth. Everything they'd worked for hinged on getting their message out, on making people understand what was at stake. As she prepared to greet the reporters, a commotion at the entrance caught her attention. A group of men in expensive suits had arrived, their polished shoes and crisp shirts a stark contrast to the casual atmosphere of the event. "The developers," Jamal muttered, his voice tight with anger. "What are they doing here?" Madison placed a calming hand on his arm. "This is good," she said, though her heart was racing. "We want them to see this, to understand what they're trying to destroy." She approached the group, drawing on every ounce of the poise and confidence she'd learned in her previous life. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet room. "Welcome to our community event. I'm Madison Green. How can I help you?" The man at the front of the group, Madison recognized him as the lead developer from their previous confrontation, looked around with barely disguised disdain. "Ms. Green," he said, his tone condescending, "I must say, this is quite the quaint little gathering you've put together." Madison refused to be baited. "It's more than that, Mr. Hawthorne," he supplied. "Richard Hawthorne. And I'm afraid this little display doesn't change anything. The development will proceed as planned." A murmur of anger rippled through the crowd that had gathered around them. Madison held up a hand, silencing them. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said, her voice level but firm, "I invite you to take a look around. Talk to the people here. See what this community really means, what it offers. Then tell me if you still think tearing it apart is the right thing to do." Hawthorne's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, a voice called out from the crowd. "Why don't you tell them about the mold, Richard?" All eyes turned to the source of the voice. A woman stepped forward, her professional attire marking her as part of Hawthorne's group, but her expression was one of determination. "Sarah," Hawthorne hissed, "this is not the time or place." "If not now, when?" the woman, Sarah, demanded. She turned to Madison. "There's toxic mold in several of the buildings they plan to demolish. They know about it, but they're planning to cover it up. If they go through with the demolition without proper containment, it could pose a serious health risk to the entire neighborhood." A shocked silence fell over the crowd, followed by an explosion of voices. Madison's mind raced, seeing both the danger and the opportunity in this revelation. "Is this true?" she asked Hawthorne, whose face had gone pale. "These are complicated issues," he blustered. "The public doesn't understand." "I think we understand just fine," Jamal interjected, his voice ringing with anger. "You're willing to poison an entire community for your profits." Madison held up her hand again, her eyes never leaving Hawthorne's face. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the tense silence, "I think it's time we had a real conversation about the future of this neighborhood, don't you?" As if on cue, the media crews that had been setting up their equipment began to move in, cameras rolling, microphones extended. Hawthorne looked trapped, his eyes darting between Madison, the angry crowd, and the waiting reporters. "Perhaps," he said finally, his voice strained, "we could discuss this in a more private setting." Madison shook her head. "No more secrets," she said firmly. "This community has a right to know what's happening. We'll discuss this here now with full transparency." What followed was unlike anything Madison had ever experienced. As the community event continued around them, she found herself at the center of an impromptu negotiation, with community leaders, developers, and city officials all weighing in. The media captured every moment, their presence ensuring that nothing could be swept under the rug. Hours passed in a blur of heated discussions, emotional testimonies from community members, and tense standoffs. Madison drew on every skill she'd ever learned, from her years in high society to her recent crash course in community organizing. She mediated, she argued, she cajoled, always keeping the needs of the community at the forefront. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the community center, a tentative agreement was reached. The development project would be put on hold pending a full environmental review. A community advisory board would be formed to have input on any future plans, and immediate steps would be taken to address the mold issue in the affected buildings. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a start. As the news spread through the event, a cautious optimism began to take hold. People who had come expecting to mourn the loss of their community were now talking excitedly about its future. Madison found herself swept up in a wave of hugs and thank yous. She saw tears in the eyes of elderly residents who had feared being forced from their homes. She saw hope on the faces of young parents who could now imagine a future for their children in this neighborhood. As the crowd began to disperse, the excitement of the day giving way to exhaustion, Madison felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Ruth standing there, her eyes shining with pride. "You did it," Ruth said softly. "You really did it." Madison shook her head, feeling overwhelmed. "We did it," she corrected. "All of us, together." Ruth pulled her into a tight embrace. "Your father would be so proud," she whispered. "Both of us are so proud." As they stood there, mother and daughter reunited, Madison felt a sense of peace wash over her. She had found her purpose, her place in the world. It wasn't in the mansions and penthouses of her past, but here, in this vibrant, struggling, beautiful community. The road ahead would not be easy. There were still battles to be fought, challenges to overcome. But as Madison looked around at the faces of her neighbors, no longer strangers but family, she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The community event had started as a desperate attempt to save a neighborhood. It had become something far more, a turning point, a new beginning. And for Madison Green, it was the final step in a journey of self-discovery, leading her not just to her roots, but to her future. As the last of the crowd drifted away, leaving behind the echoes of a day that would long be remembered, Madison, Ruth, and Jamal stood together, looking out over their community. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, a fitting end to a day of transformation and hope. "So," Jamal said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips, "what's next?" Madison looked at Ruth, then back at Jamal, feeling a surge of determination. "We keep going," she said simply. "We build on this. We make this community everything it can be." As night fell over the neighborhood, the three of them began to plan, their voices filled with hope and purpose. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it was bright with possibility. The weeks following the community event passed in a whirlwind of activity. Madison found herself at the center of a movement that was rapidly gaining momentum. The story of their neighborhood stand against the developers had caught the attention of national media, turning their local struggle into a symbol of community resistance across the country. But even as she threw herself into the work, attending meetings, giving interviews, and helping to organize the newly formed Community Advisory Board, Madison felt a growing unease. There was still unfinished business, loose ends from her old life that needed to be tied up. It was Jamal who finally broached the subject, cornering her one evening as she pored over plans for the neighborhood's revitalization. "You need to go back," he said simply, his eyes filled with understanding. "You need to confront your past if you're going to move forward." Madison sighed, knowing he was right. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "Afraid of facing them, afraid of losing this." She gestured around her, encompassing not just the modest room they stood in, but the entire community she'd come to call home. Jamal's hand on her shoulder was warm, reassuring. "This will always be your home," he said softly. "But you need to make peace with where you came from, for your sake and for Ruth's." The mention of Ruth steeled Madison's resolve. Her mother had sacrificed so much, for so long. She deserved the truth to be known, to be acknowledged for who she truly was. The next morning, Madison stood on the porch of Ruth's small house, her suitcase at her feet. Ruth emerged from inside, her eyes misty but her smile brave. "You'll come back?" she asked, and Madison could hear the years of separation, of longing in that simple question. Madison pulled her into a fierce hug. "Wild horses couldn't keep me away," she promised. "This is my home now. You're my home." As the taxi pulled away, Madison watched Ruth's figure grow smaller in the rearview mirror. She felt a mix of trepidation and determination. Whatever happened next, she knew who she was now. She was Madison Green, daughter of Ruth Johnson, and she was ready to face her past. The drive to the Green estate felt surreal, like traveling backwards in time. As the taxi wound its way up the long manicured driveway, Madison felt a sudden wave of nostalgia, quickly followed by a sense of disconnect. This place, once so familiar, now felt alien. Elizabeth Green, the woman Madison had called Mother for most of her life, was waiting on the front steps. Her perfectly coiffed hair and designer outfit were achingly familiar, but there was something different in her stance, a vulnerability Madison had never seen before. "Madison," Elizabeth breathed as Madison approached. "Oh, my darling girl, we were so worried." For a moment, Madison felt a flicker of her old self, the dutiful daughter, eager to please, but she steeled herself, remembering why she was here. "We need to talk," she said firmly. "All of us, including Father." Elizabeth's face fell slightly, but she nodded. "He's in his study. Come inside." The house was exactly as Madison remembered it, all marble floors and priceless artworks. But now she saw it through new eyes, the excess, the isolation, the coldness that no amount of expensive decor could hide. Thomas Green stood as they entered the study, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "Madison," he said, his voice gruff. You're looking well." Madison took a deep breath. "I know the truth," she said without preamble. "About Ruth. About everything." The silence that followed was deafening. Elizabeth sank into a nearby chair, while Thomas seemed to age years in a matter of seconds. "How?" he finally managed. "Does it matter?" Madison countered. "What matters is what we do now. How we move forward." What followed was the most honest conversation the Green family had ever had. Years of secrets, of pain and guilt and love poured out. Madison listened as Thomas and Elizabeth explained their choices, their fears, their regrets. She saw them not as the distant figures of her childhood, but as flawed, human, trying their best in an impossible situation. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Madison said honestly as the sun began to set outside the study windows. "Not yet. But I understand now, in a way I didn't before." Thomas nodded, his eyes suspiciously bright. "And Ruth?" he asked softly. How is she?" Madison felt a surge of protectiveness. "She's amazing," she said firmly. "Strong, loving, everything a mother should be. She raised me twice, once from afar and now up close. I'm proud to be her daughter." Elizabeth let out a small sob, quickly stifled. Madison turned to her, seeing the pain etched on her face. "You will always be important to me," she said gently. "You raised me. You loved me. That doesn't go away. But Ruth is my mother. I need you to accept that." As the difficult conversation wound down, Madison felt a weight lift from her shoulders. There was still much to be resolved, years of hurt that couldn't be erased in a single evening. But it was a start. "There's something else," Madison said as she prepared to leave. "The community where Ruth lives, where I live now, it needs help. Real, substantial help. I think the Green Foundation could make a real difference there." Thomas straightened, a hint of his old business acumen gleaming in his eyes. "Tell me more," he said. As Madison outlined her plans for community investment, for programs to help lift the neighborhood out of poverty, she saw something change in her father's face. It was as if he was seeing her, really seeing her, for the first time. "You've found your calling," he said softly when she finished. I've never been more proud of you than I am right now." The words, so long yearned for, now felt bittersweet. Madison nodded, accepting them for what they were, a recognition of her growth, of the woman she had become. As she left the Green estate, possibly for the last time, Madison felt a sense of closure. She had faced her past, confronted the lies and the pain, and had come out stronger for it. The taxi ride back to Ruth's neighborhood seemed to pass in the blink of an eye. As they turned onto the familiar street, Madison saw a group gathered on Ruth's porch. Ruth herself, Jamal, and several of the neighbors who had become like family. They were waiting for her, she realized, waiting to welcome her home. As she stepped out of the taxi, Ruth rushed forward to embrace her. "How did it go?" she asked anxiously. Madison hugged her tightly. "It was hard," she admitted, "but necessary, and I think some good might come out of it." Over Ruth's shoulder she caught Jamal's eye. He nodded, a smile of understanding and pride on his face. He had known she needed to do this, had pushed her to confront her past so she could fully embrace her future. As the impromptu welcome party moved inside, filling Ruth's small house with warmth and laughter, Madison felt a profound sense of belonging. This was where she was meant to be. These people, this community, were her true family. Later that night, as the last of the neighbors headed home, Madison found herself once again on the porch swing with Ruth. "I never imagined this," Ruth said softly, gazing out at the quiet street. "Having you here, being able to love you openly as my daughter, it's more than I ever dared to dream." Madison leaned her head on Ruth's shoulder, feeling the gentle rise and fall of her breathing. "I'm sorry it took me so long to find my way here," she said. Ruth kissed the top of her head. "You're here now. That's all that matters." As they sat together, the night settling around them like a comfortable blanket, Madison felt the final pieces of her new life falling into place. She had bridged the gap between her past and her present, had found a way to honor both sides of her heritage. The road ahead would not be easy. There were still battles to be fought for the community, relationships to be rebuilt and redefined. But for the first time in her life, Madison felt truly, completely whole. She was Madison Green, daughter of Ruth Johnson. She was a fighter, a community organizer, a bridge between worlds, and she was home. As the porch swing creaked gently in the night breeze, Madison closed her eyes, savoring the moment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference. But for now, she was content to simply be a daughter in her mother's arms, a woman who had found her place in the world. The journey that had begun with a shocking revelation had led her here, to a life richer and more meaningful than she could have ever imagined. And as the stars twinkled overhead, Madison Green smiled, ready to embrace whatever the future might hold. If this story touched your heart, then don't forget to leave a like. Use the super thanks located just below the video to directly support the channel and help create more amazing content. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any updates. Now don't miss the next incredible story that's appearing on your screen. I greatly appreciate your support and hope to see you soon. Thank you for watching.